2015 agenda if we are to meet those challenges. We're now going to focus on how far we want to go, what level of ambition is required, and how to get there. And I am honoured and delighted to welcome our three speakers. With me to discuss this, Alexander de Croo, Belgian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Development Cooperation, and our host today. Thank you so much for being with us. Helen Clark, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, a very warm welcome. It's terrific to have you here. And Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, our co-host today. So a very warm welcome to you all. We're going to dive straight in. I have lots of questions I want to ask our panel, building on our discussions this morning. I'm really identifying the way forward. So let's just jump straight in. And Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, if I could ask you first, as I say, this morning's panel unanimous about the importance of this issue, about the importance of integrating it. What for you are the major challenges we face now as we look to integrate it and then to implement it?
Okay, how many minutes I have? A few.
See how we go.
So first of all, I think it's reassuring that this morning everyone agreed on the fact that social protection is an important element. And I think that if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the fact that finally we are coming up with something which has a universal approach instead of a more directive approach, what the Millennium Development Goals were, I think for the first time, we have an opportunity here in September as a world to say, for the first time, for some topics, we're all in the same boat. And if we want to solve a few important things, which are major problems, climate change, I think migration will definitely be seen as it, radicalization, but also eradication of poverty. I think for the first time as a world, we can say, if we want to solve these things, we will all have to do it together and not just pointing fingers from one direction to the others. If you look at the Belgian development policy that we are putting in place now, there are two priorities for us. First priority is a rights-based approach in the very, very large sense, and obviously access to social protection is definitely one of the elements. The second element is economic development, but durable economic development, taking into account inclusiveness. And there, obviously, this also enters in the whole discussion. Now, if you look at the challenges, I think there are three challenges today. I think, first of all, I talked about the universality. The topic of social protection in itself is not a sustainable development goal today. In itself, you cannot isolate it as one of the 17. I think we've gone to 17 now. I understand that we will probably keep it at 17. I think that's a good thing. It's not isolated in itself, but saying that by 2030, we want the whole population to have access to social protection, I think it is something that should be part of it. Of course, and that brings me to the second challenge, is that obviously this element of social protection, you could almost say that this is the knot of a lot of other different sustainable development goals. I mean, if we would not say that giving everyone access to social protection is an important element, there's so many other different SDGs that we could never realize. I mean, looking at life expectancy, looking at giving everyone opportunity to develop their own skills in schooling and so on. So this is a central one that connects to a lot of different other elements. But the implementation in itself is a national political element. The implementation of social protection schemes, the implementation of the financing of it is by definition national, and I think it will remain a national element. So is it feasible to guarantee that by 2030 everyone should have access to social protection? Yes, but it will demand a tremendous amount of local political will. And I think that's a very, very important element, linked, I think, in balance with local political will, you need to have a discussion on financing. And and I know that the UN system calls it means of implementation. It's a very nice word. Basically we're talking about money. But I think that the whole discussion about the means of implementation, of course, should be broad enough. I think that the discussion the last months, for example, at the World Bank, there was a development committee last week at the World Bank. The president of the African Development Bank, I think, made a statement that was quite clear. He said, we African countries, we know that we will have to finance our own development. That, I think, was a very important discussion. Does that mean that official development aid has no role to play? No, not at all. But it means that the discussion today is much, much broader than official development aid. It means that the discussion is also about domestic resource mobilization, is also about fighting corruption, is also about transfer of technology, transfer of knowledge, and so on. And I'm actually surprised if you talk about domestic resource mobilization, if you look at which part of the ODA today is used, for example, in capacity building for fiscal systems, and the right fiscal systems in the countries that we're active in, this is very, very tiny. I think it's less than 1% of ODA. And if we really want to go into social protection, I think that the way going forward will be investing now, but investing in systems that become auto-financing at some point. I think if we talk about social protection, there is no way that you can finance social protection with ODA. It's completely impossible. But thinking that auto-finance social protection will just come in itself, it will not happen. This is a chicken and the egg problem, and you need to give some kind of impulse at some point. And I think that is definitely an engagement that we need to make. We need to make that engagement that we want to push it forward, but in the way that it's actually an impulse that is durable.
Thank you. And lots of issues to come back on, and very much echoing. I mean, as you said, it's not a goal in itself. This multidimensional role is part of its strength, but also poses particular challenge, and that crucial question of the means, as it's so beautifully put. Helen Clark, if I could ask you the same question. What do you see as the challenges now as we move towards the UN summit in September, both to integrate social protection and then to implement?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for asking me. There is a specific target on social protection in this open working group proposal on the SDGs goals and targets, which looks likely to be endorsed, and there are references to social protection in a range of the proposed goals. But it seems to me that the major challenge is to get people to see social protection not as some kind of optional extra or luxury, but actually as fundamental to the process of development. That you don't develop unless you lock in a level of support for people to enable them to participate in the society and take advantage of the opportunities that it could offer. And I think back to the time of the global financial crisis when the World Bank did some work on how had countries fared, and without question, the least impact was on those developing countries which had put in place social protection systems, where people didn't lose everything because of the shock. And you can look at the specifics of a program like the Mexican one, which was called Oportunidades at the time. That did lock in living standards at a certain level, and people didn't slip further backwards. One of the insights, I think, in a number of what we now see as developed countries, including my own, when the Great Depression hit, was that without social protection, people did lose everything. And there was a determination to say never again. And that, I think, is the thinking we need, that it is critical to sustaining development and progress that people are never left to fall into despair and degradation because of a shock beyond their control. Whatever the nature of that shock, the death of a breadwinner, a global financial crisis that costs jobs, a devastation like what's just happened in Nepal, many issues. So that was my first point. A second challenge, I think, is to ensure that the systems really are inclusive and comprehensive systems. And it's, You know, I visit many countries, and sometimes it's quite hard to access the social protection system because you have to be in the formal economy to do it, or you have to produce documents. And if you're in a society where you can't get a birth certificate, for example, or have any means of identifying yourself, it can be hard to get into the system. So it also needs to be associated with a kind of formalisation of birth registration, of bringing people into the formal economy rather than the informal. Then another challenge, I think, to integrate it fully into agendas is to overcome the fragmentation in provision. Many countries have very fragmented social protection. The housing ministry were doing something, the health system another, education a third, the social security something else, and they don't always interface particularly helpfully. Some people miss out altogether, some get things coming from a range of angles. So that's a challenge, to go from fragmentation to a comprehensive single system of social protection. And then my last point was going to be that the social protection systems need to be able to be responsive to, shall I say, intensifying challenges like climate change, where we are seeing so many more extreme events. And that's given rise to the work in the Sahel, for example, of the risk insurance. How do countries, how do communities, how does the individual have means to affordable risk insurance for when the worst happens? You could take another example of Ethiopia, where they have in effect a public works scheme that kicks in when the weather is so bad that you can't produce. So there's a way found for people to continue to earn and get the means of support going through a dry spell in agriculture where they can't produce. So in conclusion on this sort of opening point, I really see social protection as a means of implementation in itself for development, because without it, you'll never lock in development gains. You'll never see a sustained human development trajectory. You run the risk of losing everything, and we have to see it as so fundamental to the development process.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And as you say, and it's interesting because we have a slight, we're not quite sure why, a slight problem with the microphones and that ringing. We are trying to fix it. Apologies. Bear with us if you could. But this morning about the communications challenge. It's already come up a lot, and you talked there about, if we see it as not an optional extra, it's not a luxury, and make those arguments. I'd like perhaps to come back to that in the discussion, because that's a key role for people like you to play. But Guy, from your perspective, the key challenges, would you agree with those you've heard? Is there something else you recognize that has not been mentioned?
I've certainly not heard anything up until now that I would disagree with. But let me just perhaps add one or two further thoughts to what has been said. You mentioned that, the need to get the communications right around social protection. Now, it looks like we are going to have social protection in the ways that have already been explained as an integral part of the post-2015 agenda, and that's great. And if you just think about what that means, it would mean that we would move, if the agenda is successfully implemented, from a situation in the world today where about 70% plus of people have no access to adequate social protection coverage, to the type of universal social protection coverage that Minister de Croo has talked about. It's an extraordinary achievement if it's within our reach. And the fact of the matter is, and this is where the communications messaging comes in, it is within our reach. And here is the first obstacle, I think, that we have to overcome. Not so much in the setting of the agenda, because it looks like we're going to get there, unless something extraordinary happens between now and September. But I still think there is a lingering perception, and it's pretty widespread, that social protection is still a sort of a rich country phenomenon. And somehow that you need to get rich, or you need to attain a certain threshold of prosperity until you can allow yourself social protection. And that's simply wrong. It's wrong at several levels. It's bad history. It's bad economics. Countries which today have mature social protection systems, with all the stresses that they may face because of demographics and all the rest, they didn't start when they were rich. They started when they were a lot less rich than they are today. And the fact of the matter is social protection is part of successful development processes. It isn't that plug-on that comes once you've succeeded. And that means, and this I think is something we've got to get across, that social protection is appropriate and is possible and is affordable at all levels of development, including the least developed countries. And I think that's extremely important. A second point is, and it's already been alluded to, social protection looks like a cost when you look at a national budget, but it truly is an investment, and that's not just a slogan or a phrase. Effective social protection, and Helen just said it, it is a means of implementation of development because of two things. Societies which have effective social protection are actually increasing their own productive potential. And if you look at the early pioneers of social protection, I suppose Bismarck stands out as the first one. He was no friend of working people or their organizations. He did a lot to put them down. But he understood very well that social protection was a key to an effectively functioning economy. And so social protection does allow people to enter into the labor force. It does allow them to become productive members of a workforce. It protects them in the way that Helen has described from adversity. It enables economies to adapt. You can move, you can change, you can swap jobs, you can even lose a job if you know you're going to be able to find a way back and be protected in the meantime. So social protection is a lubricant of successful economic performance, and it also helps resilience in the face of environmental degradation and disaster as well. So it does tend to be something which integrates the three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, the social, and the environmental. And lastly, all of the evidence shows for every dollar spent on social protection, you get between 1.8 and 2.5 dollars back through multiplier effects in increased production. And I think financing is an issue. I'm not trying to pretend it isn't an issue, but I think that we have to look to kick-starting social protection schemes which can and should become sustainable from domestic resources. I think there's an international responsibility to get these things up and running, and that's where the ILO concept of social protection platforms begin. But as Minister de Croo has said, and is in the very logic of what we are all saying, I think, in the end, social protection have to be and can be sustainable parts of successful economic performance, and that's what we're all aiming at.
Thank you very much. So that core message, not only is an investment, but you get a return, and an immediate return on your investment. Minister de Croo, from your perspective, this communications challenge and the convincing of the unconvinced, as it was put this morning, but also linked to that, how ambitious should we be when we look at the targets, when we look at how to do this, and how ambitious do you think politically and really, how ambitious can we be in terms of the role of social protection? Now, there was a suggestion this morning from one of our panelists that you need to put the systems in place and then gradually expand them, but the crucial thing is to deal with the structure. How ambitious can and should we be? And linking that to the communication challenge, what will publics as well as governments be able to swallow, as it were?
I think by saying that if the ambition is by 2030, everyone should be able to get access to social protection, this is quite ambitious.
Yeah.
I mean, this, knowing at how many people today do not have it, it's incredibly ambitious, knowing, for example, and I think we should focus on the least developed countries. I think this is really where we need to make the difference today. It's about the bottom billion, and in those bottom billion countries, it's approximately 40 countries. In general, 95% of the economy is informal. And so that's gigantic, because if you are talking about social protection, this is one of the most powerful levers you have to push towards formalizing the economy. Now, today, in a lot of these countries, the discussion that you should push from informal to formal economy, not everyone agrees on this, because a lot of people say, well, but this informal economy is helping so many people. If you are doing this in a too stringent way, it's actually going to block everything. Still, if we look at economic growth, and economic growth, I think, will be the factor that is helping to give everyone in a population a perspective. If you look at how it's happening today, I mean, let's look at the DRC, for example, which is for us the main country we are active in. The DRC today has economic growth of 8%. 8% economic growth. This is China-like economic growth. The problem is that the population looks at it and says, I don't see it. I don't see it, I don't feel it, and I have the feeling that someone is benefiting, but it's not me. And if you really talk about the 1%, this is for me the real discussion of the 1%, is that economic growth that today I think is way too much dependent on natural resources and so on. How do you translate that into a system that actually is going to benefit everyone? And I think the way going forward is always going to be step by step. And very often what you see is in developing social protection schemes is often the first element is systems around maternity leave. And I think that is a very important one because it touches on, for me, one of the essential problems we have to tackle in the least developed countries is the maternity rate. I mean, on average, if you look at in Congo or in Niger, I think the maternity rate is six children per, I would say per woman, but it's often per girl. I mean, often girls become pregnant at the age of 11 or 12 years old, and if the average is 7, some of them get 10, 11 children. Building something around maternity insurance and maternity leave, I think, is a very sensible first step. And there, I think as Guy said, you need to kickstart this. I mean, if someone is not putting in the means for a first round of giving benefits, because when you start giving benefits, you will also start having revenues, and then the whole system starts to run. But the discussion is on social protection for everyone by 2030. The real focus in the beginning should be the least developed countries. And the whole discussion on least, I mean, if you look at the OECD statistics for last year, the ODA, there's a whole discussion on ODA, the ODA to the least developed countries has decreased by 16%. It has decreased for the least developed countries. This is a major issue. And I think that the discussions we will have in the next months, we should focus much more on the least developed countries.
Can I just clarify one thing, though? When you say that focus, and as you say, you need to do it step by step, the bottom billion, but nevertheless, within a global agenda, I mean, the key principle of these new goals is that they are universal, they're for developed countries and developing. You are not arguing against that. You are arguing for a focus within that. How do we get started, as it were? Is that right?
I think the basic element of the SDGs is that it's universal, and let's be fair, if we talk about social protection, in Belgium we have some work to do too. And I'm quite sure that in New Zealand there's some work to be done. So this is, everyone will have their own priorities. But if you look at where the financing needs to go in the first step, it's definitely in the least developed countries.
Thank you. I want to come back on that financing question, but Helen Clark, in terms of the level of ambition, and also this question of the global perspective, because some people say, well, how can you do this when there is no one size fits all, and we've already heard that very clearly, that each country must own and define its own agenda in this area. How do you then argue, yes, but we do need this overarching global umbrella. It is very important that this is universal. So 2 questions, if I might. The global perspective, and how ambitious do you think we should be?
Well, firstly, I think that global goals are important because they are setting development priorities. And one of the discussions we're having in the UN Development Group now is how to land this agenda in countries, because it is a big and complex agenda, a much more transformational agenda than the MDGs were. But the fact that something is identified as a priority in this agenda is important, and there are things in this agenda which weren't in the MDGs at all. Now, you know, whether the poorest countries can tackle all of the agenda with its great breadth in the short term is another matter. But I think in our advocacy, we need to be advocating for what is really going to kickstart and have multiple spillover effects. And one of those things is social protection because of its means of implementation character. But I think as the debate goes on, we also need to be encouraging countries to see social protection as more than just a kickstart for development. And I have been in conversations where emerging economies, which have introduced cash transfer schemes, have said, oh, well, we expected that this was just to get development going, and then we could kind of move on from that. And I've said, no, no, no. What has underwritten development in Europe, my own country, Canada, Australia, it has been that you see social protection as part of the ongoing fabric of the society. You say, you are saying never again to what happened in the Great Depression. You're saying there will always be, if you leave everything just to the market, people who completely miss out because they're sick, they're old, they're children with no visible means of support, their families down on their luck because the job market moved on. So you must build a thinking about human development into the system in an ongoing way. It's not a one-off to move people out of extreme poverty. It's something that must continue. You mentioned the very high growth rates, for example, in DRC. And what we see is that at this stage of development in Africa, there is not as much poverty reduction as there was at a similar stage in Asian development. You're getting these high headline growth rates, but not enough human development for it. So there again is where I think global goals, priorities, the dialogue about what will really move things forward and lock it in for the longer term becomes very important. And as for cost, I mean, the ILO has done good work on this, showing that basic protection systems will come in at about 1% to 2% of GDP. I mean, if you make it a priority, it's not going to break the bank, and as Guy said, it will repay itself a couple of times over as a worthwhile investment.
Thank you. I say, want to come back on that financing issue, but Guy, I'm very, very struck there because you said not a rich country phenomena. Helen Clark there pointing to another problem, which is those who see it as, oh, no, it's when we're right at the beginning and then we drop it. So many different misperceptions about what is. Question there, can you have a global agenda when people are coming at it from such different perspectives? How important is it that it's global for you?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential. It is part of a global agenda which is emerging. And it must be. And despite appearances, we're saying the same thing. That is to say that I think the view from the Minister, and I would subscribe, and I'm sure Helen would as well, is we need to give a kickstart through the post-2015 agenda to get things up and running in certain countries, particularly the least developed countries. But social protection is not just a temporary phase of development, it's a permanent phenomenon. The most advanced countries require social protection systems. The reason that some of the most advanced economies of the world are successful is because they've integrated social protection, not as sort of something in isolation or apart from the mainstream of economic and social policy making, but very much integrated into the mainstream of economic and social policy making. I think we all understand, those of us who work in the world of work, that social protection policies and employment policies are very intimately interrelated. And that is a permanent state of affairs. And I think we're all saying the same, we're trying to give the same message there. Now, a universal agenda with shared goals across the world does not obviate or exclude a very wide variety of national experiences and national policies. This is not a one-size-fits-all agenda, even if we're driving towards the same goal at the end. And so the ILO makes very clear through our own recommendation on social protection floors, firstly, that countries are perfectly at liberty to, indeed must, set levels of social protection in accordance with their circumstances. We're not talking about installing in the least developed countries levels of social protection that you might know in Belgium or New Zealand, or indeed the country where I come from. That's not the point. It's about a floor that can be moved up as circumstances permit. But I do think that universal coverage becomes a very clear goal and is integrated into the SDGs, the embryonic SDG agenda. Financing of these floors can take place in very different ways, and I think anybody who takes the time to look at national experience already underway will see how different countries have adopted different approaches, again, very much according to their circumstances. Bolivia has used revenues from gas exports to finance pensions. Mongolia has put in place universal child benefits from copper revenues. Brazil has used a financial transactions tax to help poor households, and the examples abound. They won't always be the same, but they all fall within what I think is very, very important, which is this universal, common, global agenda. I don't see a contradiction in that. I actually see a unifying theme within which a very varied set of national experiences fit very well.
So the trick is, though, to get that right between those global objectives, as you said, they're very important of themselves, that national, but to get the balance between we have a global perspective, but it is tailor-made, it is, you set your own agenda. That's the clever balancing act, as it were, that we need to strike.
Or the fact that I agree that national ownership is vitally important, as indeed is implied by the appeal to domestic resource mobilization, which must be a part of this. So I see no contradiction,
well,
if you
yeah,
like, or
sure.
a balancing act, but I think the two things are perfectly compatible. National ownership and design, global goals.
Thank you. Minister, would you agree with that? Because you said at the beginning, by definition, this is national, but nevertheless the importance of this global umbrella, if I can put it that way without mixing metaphors too much.
Well, what the SDGs will do is to have, because some people complain that there are 17 goals and it's going to be complicated and so on. I don't agree with that criticism. I mean, we will boil down the development goals of 194 countries down to 17 elements. I don't think that's that bad, because we are in very different situations throughout the world, and this has the ambition to try to tackle kind of all the important elements that we have. What will happen is that, of course, based on those 17 goals and then the sub-goals that we will have, for every country there will be a goal, there will be a plan, there will be an agenda of what it will be. It will be challenged by other countries and so on. And then afterwards, when you have agreed on that, then the next 15 years you will put it into place. So it will be adapted to the situation of each different country, but you set some high-level goals. I think for eradicating poverty, climate change and so on, we all know that a purely national plan without taking into account the dynamics with what is happening in the rest of the world will never have any effect. But if you go to the discussion of implementing social protection, well, this by definition is local legislature, it's local ownership, it's local leadership also. I think if you want this something to be owned, I mean, a social system is by definition, I mean, this is a social contract. It's a contract between people who work where they say, well, I'm willing to contribute, knowing that when I have a problem, when I'm old, when I have children, and so on, there will be some coverage over that. So it's by definition a contract within a country. Yeah. If you want this to be something that is owned by everyone, you cannot just impose it from the outside, but you can help from the outside to make it work.
Thank you. Helen Clark, if I could just ask, just on that point about the 17 goals, because Ambassador Frankinet also referred to this morning, some people have expressed concerns. One of the overriding principles was supposed to be that what came out of all of this was easy to communicate, and with 17 goals, some argue uncommunicable or more difficult, potentially unmanageable. But within that, when you look at, so comment to that if you would, but also when we've talked already about, and you've all talked about social protection being the thing that ties many of them together. So can that be an asset? But how, on the other hand, I think it was you who raised the challenge of fragmentation, and given how multidimensional social protection is the risk greatest there? And how do you see the key to an effective approach to deal with that?
Well, Firstly, on the agenda, the member states of the UN and their work on the Open Working Group did not come up with an outcome consistent with what Rio +20 asked for, which was for a concise and limited set of goals with targets which were measurable. Now, you won't find any appetite, however, for reopening that among the member states, because across 17 goals and 169 targets, everybody gets something. And so the feeling's always been among them that if you reopen it, then if it starts to be picked away at, you unpick the whole, the whole consensus that was there. So it is what it is, even though it wasn't what Rio +20 asked for. One of the key things now, I think, is to try and ensure that the targets actually are measurable, not political statements, because there's no point in having a political statement as a target. That needs to go in a chapeau, not in a target, and that the indicators contribute to the measurability. Look, I think we have to be honest, there is a capacity challenge for low-income countries with implementing such a complex agenda. And that's where development partners need to apply their minds as to how to support countries to overcome the capacity constraints. And inevitably, countries will look at this broad agenda, and they will do some internal prioritisation. I think what's of concern to many of us is that in that prioritisation we not see issues like social protection, women's empowerment and equality, sexual and reproductive health drop through the cracks. And it was harder for women's equality and sexual and reproductive health to drop through the cracks with 8 MDGs and 29 targets. But if you cast it into a much broader net, these things can lose visibility. So we very much have to, in my opinion, guard against that. But in the end, implementation happens because countries care about it, because they care about taking an agenda like this, looking at how it fits alongside their existing national development agenda, being prepared to say, well, actually, we hadn't taken that on board as fully as we could have, looking then for the partnerships which will enable them to move forward in areas that perhaps were neglected in the vision that they had. Now, on the issue of the fragmentation of the systems, I suppose I bring I'll bring my kind of national experience to bear on this, because my country, for the most part, hasn't had individual contribution style systems of social protection. It's gone for a universal taxpayer-based pension and universal tax-paid healthcare. And so if you're seeing these things as public goods financed out of general taxation, you tend to get less fragmentation because it's there as a good for access by everybody. Where we actually did get a little bit of overlap and problem was the accident insurance scheme, which gave comprehensive accident cover based on individual contributions and employer contributions, but often meant that the person who had an accident and needed an operation got preference over the person who needed an operation for something that had nothing to do with an accident. So a lot of thought needs to go into the design of how different systems interact if we want to be equitable and fair about the access people have to basic services and income protection.
Thank you. Just on this question of the capacity challenge that you raised, because we focused, and a lot of our attention is focused inevitably on the financing. That's the argument that people make when they want to say this is too difficult, too idealistic. But there are those two sides to it, and as you say, the role of development partners. I'm just wondering how important for each of you this question of helping to strengthen public administrations. You mentioned earlier a question also of registration and sort of these very practical challenges for many, many countries. How important do you think, alongside the issues of maybe some help with financing, startup financing, call it what you will, the technical assistance, the capacity building? Guy, how crucial will that be?
I think it will be very important. I think that building national capacities to operate successful social protection schemes is a necessary starting point. And I think in the first instance, that is where international development assistance needs to be focused. Less in the recurrent costs involved, although there may be a running-in period, but very much in building the capacities. You know, the ILO's own experience in this is perhaps somewhat instructive. One of the social protection floor mechanisms I've had to look at at first hand was in Mozambique, where a least developed country, which is in the process of putting together, I think, quite a credible and quite an impressive social protection floor. How did it go? Well, we operated, and this is an element of the conversation that I'd like to underline. We worked, and you might find this surprising, some of you in the crowd, with the International Monetary Fund to make this happen. A division of responsibilities. The IMF did the actuarial financial task of seeing what the so-called fiscal space available was. So they identified basically the resource base, with the government taking responsibility for ensuring that those resources were brought to bear for the purposes that were required. And the ILO's job was to design the mechanisms of social protection provision. And it worked. At least up until now, it's worked. We've made a good start in Mozambique. And that, I think, sort of illustrates 2 points. The first one is the one that you have asked about. That is to say, the need for the international community to be particularly present and active in assisting in capacity building. I think there's a big tick in that box. And by the way, you know, if it's a contributory scheme that you're talking about, you'll find very few people willing to contribute, you know, 1% of their earnings to social insurance schemes, which they have no confidence will be run fairly or will provide them with a pension or a benefit when it's needed. So there's an element of confidence in that story as well. The second point is about the need for different parts. We've talked about the fragmentation of national social protection schemes. It's very important that the international system is not found to be fragmented or to be wanting in coherence. And a couple of things are happening internationally which I think help us to respond to that need internationally. The ILO, together with the World Bank, is chairing an interagency committee around social protection to make sure that we're all doing the things that we have to do, not at cross purposes, not in contradiction. And I think that needs to be, really emphasized. Also, and Helen, you might remember this, we signed a letter together to all of the UN resident coordinators that Helen is the boss of around the world, asking them to work together with the different agencies represented in country to help build social protection floors. So I think fragmentation is a danger we all need to be aware of, not just in national capacities, but in the performance of the international system as well.
And I'd like very much to come back on this question of, I mean, you said there you might be surprised, we might be surprised you work with the IMF. Different roles, how you collaborate, how you cooperate, who does what, if you like. But if we could hold that just for a minute, and Minister, on this question of the balance, to say sometimes it is financing to help get the process started. But this crucial question, and you raised it earlier, about how you use ODA and where you use it, this capacity building, technical assistance, thinking also perhaps technological assistance. We're in a digital age, digitalization, birth register, all those sorts of things. Do you think this is important as anything to do with the financing of the system, that these issues are just as important? Or
yes, definitely. I think the whole digital element is today, I think, in looking at development, one of the biggest opportunities we have. And I think that it should be, the opportunity of digital should be something that is somewhere part of the SDGs. If you make something for the next 15 years, the opportunity that you have there to have more transparency, to have more efficiency, to have more accountability, it's one of the biggest opportunities we have. And there are examples throughout the world today. One of the things that Belgian development has worked on, for example, is systems for paying policemen in Afghanistan. And they used to be paid with an envelope. And now they are paid on mobile payments on their cell phone. And the big surprise was that actually policemen found out that their salary was a double of what they used to get. So the salary they got on the cell phone was a double of what they get from the envelopes. That's because the envelopes, of course, had some multiple dipping, if you could call it.
Nice phrase.
And so one of the strongest elements you have today, and actually some Belgians in the room might find that a bit ironic, But developing fair tax systems is something that we're actually quite good at. And I know that in the national discussion, some people might doubt that, but this is something that we are actually doing in a lot of countries. Because this is one of the issues you have today, is that the tax mobilization or the domestic resource mobilization in a lot of the least developed countries has a few challenges. One challenge we already talked a lot about is the informal economy. The other challenge is way too many tax exemptions. Very often there are tax exemptions given in all directions, sometimes with good reasons, sometimes very often for particular reasons of one or another interest group. And so the trying to capture part of the value added that is developed in a country is today not enough developed. And so if you believe that the development going forward is economic development in an SME way, if I can call it easily, if you want to do that in the right way, you need to have the right tax policy to cover that. And then there are a lot of different topics in there. There is a topic of just designing it. There's a topic of having the local administration to cover it. There's a topic of technology and, for example, registration. I mean, how can you have good social protection if in a few countries of the world today a lot of babies are never registered? I mean, if you don't exist on paper, how could you ever get some kind of social protection? And so there, I think that private partners in the large sense obviously have a role to play, but the design of the policy, by definition, is something that should be covered by politics and by a parliamentary process. I mean, having politics being able to discuss on what the policy is and how it is implemented and being able to challenge it needs a democracy that is functioning in a good way. And this is a topic that we won't cover today, but everything we discussed here is impossible in a country where you do not have basic security, basic political stability.
And also that crucial issue, Helen Clark, if I can really, I asked, is technical capacity building assistance as important? One leads to the other from what you're saying, because if the taxation system works fairly, if you clamp down on illicit flows and all of that, then you have the fiscal space to do a lot of this. Do you see the two things very much in tandem? And a word too, if you could, to this, very struck by the word used earlier, the talk about, we talk about not just governments, but this sense of fairness and this sense of confidence in what is being done will be crucial to make it work, won't it?
Well, the first question you pose goes to the very heart of the Addis Ababa Conference on Financing for Development, which will be held in the second week in July. And the critical challenge is, how do you go from billions to the trillions needed to achieve sustainable development? Right now, we have developed countries, OECD countries, putting $135.2 billion a year into ODA, with less, as you said, going into the low-income countries. But UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, has priced achieving the SDGs across key sectors in developing countries at between 3.3 trillion and 4.5 trillion a year. So what in that scenario then is the role of ODA? It's absolutely critical that it is catalytic in building the systems and capacities which will unleash a process of development that grows economies, the capacity to tax the revenue and put into place the budget priorities and the allocations and the systems of delivery. There's a virtuous chain there, and also catalytic in supporting the governance and the rule of law and everything that surrounds that, which will enable investment and trade and confidence and deal with the illicit financial flows and so on. So there's a whole logic that runs through that. Now, on delivery systems, there are very interesting examples now, particularly in some of the middle-income countries, which are trying to clean up delivery and get one-stop shop approaches to delivery of basic services. And you can go to, for example, Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan and go to these one-stop shops where people in one place can get all the documentation they need to register a child, get a passport, apply for the pension, the family support, the motor vehicle registration, and so on. And when you ask people, what difference has this made to you, what they say is, it used to take me a week to go around all the different offices and queue for these things. And also, to get to the top of the queue, you often had to pay a backhander. So actually cleaning up public administration and ability to deliver services is extremely, extremely important. Now, on the catalytic role of ODA, let's also acknowledge that spills over into accessing climate finance as well. Public grant finance for climate will be a small part of the overall financing. So the ability to be bankable for the sustainable infrastructure and so on, and for adaptation becomes extremely important. Last point, there was some mention of some of the issues around ICT and inclusive finance, if I could put it that way. There has been a commission running for several years now, which co-chaired by UNESCO and the International Telecommunications Union, which has been pushing the concept of broadband for development. And there are now references to the role of ICT in development across around 8 of the sustainable development goals. And we can all see the applications in education, health, and so on. But where it links into some of this discussion around social security, cash transfers, payments, is this sort of better than cash approach, because as you said, police didn't used to get all the salary in the envelope, right? Somebody raked it off. So if you go to inclusive finance using the mobile technologies in particular, then you can ensure that the money goes straight to the person. And we have been involved with very innovative applications of this. We've done the help with the delivery of the Afghan police salaries through the digital means. With the Ebola response, where we've been responsible for paying response workers, it's been done in partnership with mobile technology companies. With response to the Philippines terrible typhoon Haiyan, the cash for work payments were done through the mobile phone. So again, this technology can help get people what they're entitled to in full without anybody ripping it off, and it deals with the corruption. And it also introduces people to banking systems for the first time, which is very important, because without some kind of banking system through your phone or whatever, what do you do with your money? It goes under the pillow, it could be stolen, it's harder to budget and plan. So again, it's sort of part of this means of implementation of sustaining development.
Yes, thank you. Just want to turn to the question of the different roles of the different players, because you've all talked. Helen, you talked about the role of development partners earlier. You were talking there about the role of the private sector and how you see the balance between the two, Minister. And Guy Ryder, you started with the reference to the International Monetary Fund and working together with them and the different agencies and how you coordinate. As we go forward, and I think the three, so far I would call today the conference of the 3 Cs. The things that have been mentioned most are communication, cooperation and collaboration. But it's something that's very easy to talk about and not always so easy to do. As we look to the implementation phase for the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly, but particularly in this area, who does and should do what? How do we get the right collaboration, right assignment of tasks to make sure that we can really deliver on this agenda in the most efficient and effective way? What is the key between international organisations, between the public and private, between countries, within countries? What is the key to this? Who would like to? Minister.
There's a whole discussion on the SDGs where, we're in the phase of defining what are they and what means will we have to implement them. I think there's a third discussion on what is the most effective role for which organization to do that. And I think that's the direction you're going. And I think at some point there needs to be an evaluation to start with at the multilateral organizations what we have, which have developed like mushroom. We have a lot of different ones, often with very good intentions. Some of them were designed to be temporary, and they stayed. And so the whole discussion on who is doing what, what's the most effective way to do it in the UN discussion, it's called the fit for purpose discussion, I think is an important one which we should tackle, but let's not tackle everything at once. So let's not mix the different discussions. I think we will have that discussion, but every discussion at its own time. As we all know, there are organizations which are normative, and there are organizations which are working on the ground. I think that distinction, we should try to reestablish that distinction, being normative, being on the ground. I think also that if we want to do it properly, so the whole discussion on a social contract, helping in designing the system, kickstarting the system, asking also to have measures against corruption and so on and so on. Basically, this leads towards some kind of pact decision that you take almost on a national level, if you're talking about social protection. This also means, I think, that if we could call it donor countries in the old definition, we should do more coordination ourselves too. I mean, today, my thinking has always been, if we would just restart development from a blank page, let's say today development has never existed and we start from zero. Would we do it the same way as we do it today? I don't think so. I think we would do it in a very, very different way. I would imagine that an organization such as UNDP, we would say, well, at national level, let's just decide that we have one organization that is doing the development work on the ground, and that we would just have a very different way of financing it than what we do today, where national interests very often play a very, very determinant role, very often from a past, but also very often because we are doing certain things in a country, and it is always very hard to say, well, let's just stop everything and give our money to another organization. But if we would start from a blank page, I'm convinced that you would do it in a very, very different way. So we never start from a blank page. No. We never start from a blank page, unfortunately. But the idea of having much more coordination in the countries that we are active, and there the European Union definitely can play a very, very important role. But I also think that the SDGs will play an important role, because for once we will have an agenda, and we will be able to say, okay, within that agenda, what is your role, what is your role, what is your role, and how do we work together with multilateral organizations, and how do we work together with the private sector? I think it's been put forward. I think to realize the SDGs, you need 4% of GDP, approximately, of the world. Today, we're discussing about 0.7% ODA, which is an important discussion. But even if we all achieve 0.7%, we're still far away from the 4% that we need. So the private sector will have to play a role in this. The question is, how do you do this? Because some people call it leveraging, some people call it blending. I mean, this is the vocabulary in the development world. But how do you do it? I mean, how do you put the same standards? How do you make sure that the risk is not only on the public money and the profit is only on the private money? How do you organize this? I think we're still in a very, very new field. And this is a little bit the R&D of development, I think.
So innovation is going to be crucial here. So in terms of, it's very interesting that in terms of cooperation and collaboration and deciding who does what, Minister there suggesting really, it almost links back to my first question about the global perspective. By having that global agenda, it's easier to begin to work it out. For you, Ryder, what is the crucial, in terms of fostering, making sure everyone does what they should, as it were, the fit for purpose discussion, but more broadly, how do we make sure this cooperation, public, private, that everybody is playing their part?
Yeah, I think schematically I can see three pieces to this puzzle. One is the one that's been pointed to, you've just pointed to in your question. The multilateral system has got to ensure that its part in this process is undertaken with a maximum of coherence and a maximum of efficiency. And Helen and I will be going on from here to a UN meeting where I suspect we're going to have a very long discussion about fit for purpose and what we should all do. And what's interesting is that discussion is taking place very specifically against the backdrop of the post-2015 agenda. And I'd like to think there's a sort of mutual sort of reinforcing process at work here, that, you know, because the SDGs are coming up, they are forcing the multilateral system in a very welcome way to work better together, to be more fit for purpose. And at the same time as we do that, we'll be helping to ensure the success of the SDGs. So that's the first part. The second part, and it's inescapable, is national responsibilities. Now, we've talked earlier on in the conversation about whether having 17 goals is too complicated, not practicable, you can't communicate it, who's going to take any notice? I think the obverse of that issue is the fact that this agenda, whatever one thinks of it, sitting here in Brussels today, is the result of a multilateral negotiation in which all member states have participated. It seems to me not unreasonable to suppose that if this is the collective product of national governments' negotiations, they should feel and have a responsibility for taking ownership of that agenda and then undertaking the critical step, and I think it is critical, of ensuring that this agenda is translated into, incorporated into national development strategies. I think this is an absolutely key process. The good news is it's taking place in some member states already. But then, the multilateral superstructure will count for little if that national level integration does not take place. And the third part of the jigsaw is, as has been indicated, this public-private partnership. Let's all accept that ODA will not cover the whole bill, that it must be catalytic and set in motion this virtuous process in the private sector. And let's also take on board the Minister's point that it is not the public purse that's going to pay simply for private benefit in this process. We've got to get the terms of this public-private partnership right. And I have to say that the thing that worries me, if you look at the outside world today, is you have a private sector which is singularly failing to invest in the real economy. That's what we've got. You've got lots of liquidity out there. Nobody can say there isn't a lot of money out there. There's massive amounts of liquidity out there. It's not being invested in the real economy. That's why our economies are not growing. It's also the reason why our stock markets are growing exponentially. So we have a problem already, before you get to the post-2015 development agenda, in channeling private sector funds into productive investment spaces which can move us forward.
Thank you very much. Helen Clark, a word on this question of the who should do what and how we foster the collaboration and cooperation, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions from the discussion. Please.
Well, I think you answer that at two levels. One is what happens at the country level and then the global level. And at the country level, one of the very important capacities to build is the capacity for coordinating the donors so that the donors aren't tripping over each other in the same sectors with the same projects. And believe me, for a lot of developing countries, they have so many people coming at them. I sometimes wonder anything gets done, because it's said that a country like Vietnam gets 500 missions a year, all coming to, say, we can do this for you, we can do that for you.
It's for the hotel industry.
The conference industry, but not so good if you're trying to get on with development. So where we often work alongside developing countries is in supporting the capacity to coordinate the donors and then the donors themselves, through their own mechanisms in country, coordinating as well. Who's best at what, who's going to go for what sectors and so on. Now the same, of course, applies then within the UN family. And one plea I have of member states is please don't set up any new organisations, please. Member states have been very good at setting up organisations. They never close them down. They always set up new ones. And so I chair this family, this unruly family of 28 to 30 agencies or departments or entities of some kind. And it's not easy because, over time each has developed its own ways of dealing with things. I mean, we have venerable institutions like the ILO. It goes back to the aftermath of World War I, correct, Guy? And other agencies in the multilateral system like the International Postal Union and the ITU, they go back to somewhere in the 19th century. So, but no, a lot of organisations have been set up, and it doesn't make the job easy. On the other hand, once they're set up and they're a specialised agency and they've got their own board, the will to do anything about dismantling that just isn't there. So it is what it is, and through the way in which we work together, we have to be coherent. And as Guy said, the whole debate about sustainable development as a big and complex agenda and how can we support countries has us very focused on how we collaborate to do that. And coming through the discussion on that is clearly a desire to have less representational presence and more substantive presence, to see our country teams characterised by an issue-based coalition approach where in the development partnership agreement we have with the governments, we identify where we can add value as a group and pool our expertise around those issues, and we need to be results-focused, impact-focused, and accountable for that. So we are doing a lot of work on these issues to make a system that's grown like Topsy at least work to get itself effective.
Okay, thank you so much. Almost out of time, and I want to do something very unfair. Accepting that the premise of this question is not fair, that there is no magic bullet, there is no one thing that we need to do now in order to ensure that social protection takes the place that you and all our speakers today have agreed, the place it should take in the post-2015 agenda, and that it is implemented to address all the issues we've been talking about. For each of you, and you have 1 minute each, and I'm going to protection to play this multi-dimensional role that you've all said is so important for our economic success around the globe and all the other issues we've talked about. Your priority. Guy Ryder first.
Well, I think in the light of where we are today, where we stand with the elaboration of the agenda, all of the issues that we have discussed today, I think what is really needed, and it's very often the case, isn't it, in issues like this, is the push from the public, the push from citizenship, the push from civil society. And looking at this hall today, I think we've got a good idea of how this can happen. We know this is doable. We know that the need is there. I think it's people holding governments and international organizations accountable for getting the job done. It's as simple as that. And by the way, I think we need to do this, I don't like the word, marketing of the SDGs pretty quickly to get that impulse to move forward as we must.
Thank you very much. We'll have a session on the role of civil society at the end of today. Helen Clark, your priority.
I think my priority would be to really support the exchange of experiences on social protection across developing countries. We see examples of effective social protection in some of the poorest countries on earth, like Ethiopia, but other poor countries haven't done it. So how do we exchange those experiences? How do people learn from the experience of Brazil? How do they learn from the experience of India's National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme? There's a lot of experiences out there, and then the development actors come in with supporting the capacity to design something that meets the national circumstances. There may be some bilateral donor support needed to get things kick-started, but longer term, the funding of social protection has to be built in as a priority to be paid for from taxes within developing countries.
Thank you very much. Minister de Croo, you have the last word.
So, if you allow me a few priorities, but they're at different levels. So, first priority, I think, is which countries are we talking about? And there I want to re-emphasize the focus on the least developed countries. I think the bottom billion, this is 1 billion people who do not even have the perspective of improvement of their lives within their life expectancy. So this should really be the focus. Second priority is, I think, the whole element of capacity building in social systems, healthcare systems, and taxation systems. I think if we want to have sustainable welfare systems in the large sense, you, by definition, also need to invest in the funding of those welfare systems. And then third priority, I think, and I think Helen has already put it forward, is more coordination. I think very often, as you said, we stumble one over the other at some regions. Unfortunately, the world is not fair. The competition of misery is absolutely not fair. And today we speak about one region, but after some time there's some fatigue coming in, and we just automatically focus on other regions. It's not because we look at another region that the problems are not solved in one region. And so if we do a little bit more coordination, I think we can have more results.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our speakers very much indeed? Thank you so much. A fascinating discussion. We will delve into all of this in more detail in our next session, but thank you so much to all three of you. Coffee is now served, and we will resume in 30 minutes' time. Thanks a lot.